Ray's Reviews, welcome back. You know what? Anyone who follows my channel, you probably realize one of my favorite lenses is the Helios 44-2. I probably featured it on the channel one too many times. But a question I had, and a question a lot of people ask is there a wider version of that lens? Because using it on a crop sensor camera, it's kind of too zoomed out. It took me a while, but I found something very interesting. This is a lens, it's called the Mir 37mm 1B. It's a 2.8 aperture, and it's also a Soviet lens like the Helios. But more importantly, it has the same swirly character as the Helios. And it also has a very interesting history. I'll tell you about that a little later. But the question is, how does this lens stack up or compare to the Helios? Is it worth getting? If you're curious, I'm going to show you everything I know about this lens. Stay tuned. Like a lot of popular Soviet lenses, this Mir 37 is based on a Carl Zeiss design, but that's a whole nother subject. It's based on the Flektogon. But the history of this lens is it was released in 1954, but it was so well received that in Germany at the 1958 Brussels World's Fair, it received a prestigious award. And ever since then, every model has had stamped on the barrel, Grand Prix Brussels 1958. They were so proud of it. And this lens was produced for decades after that, up into the early 80s. Alright, so here's the main question people are going to ask. Why would you want to use an old lens, decades old, like this? Well, we hear the word character all the time. I'm not going to keep saying it. I'm just going to show you some pictures and how it looks. Pay close attention to the background though. What I like about the way this lens does the background is it has a slight swirl to it, similar to the Helios, except not as strong. But what I like even more is look at the highlights. They have a kind of wet, bubbly sparkle to them that is unique, and it's kind of beautiful to me, and it's something I just can't find in any of my modern lenses. So I'm going to show you a few pictures, check them out, and see what you think. One thing I had to learn when I got this lens is I need to stop comparing it to the Helios. I kept wondering, why isn't the background as blurry? Why isn't it as good in low light? It took me a while to get through my head that it's a wide angle lens. It's not going to have as much background blur. The aperture is only 2.8. It's not F2 like the Helios. So it's not going to be as good in low light. So once I really started shooting it as a wide angle lens and within its limits, that's when I started having fun with it and getting the most out of it and appreciating it more. Another cool thing to do with this lens is purposely shoot black and white type images or vintage type images. Sometimes when I use my modern lenses like that, they just look too crisp and perfect. But when you use something like this, it has that softness in the corners. It just looks like something that was taken a long time ago, but it doesn't look bad. It has that vintage look. So that's a perfect application for using this lens if you know you're going to be shooting vintage type, black and white type of photos. Check out some of these examples. Alright, like so most of these old lenses, they have a strength and a weakness, and one of the weaknesses of this particular lens, like a lot of lenses, is when you open the aperture all the way, the corners of the image get softer than the center. So one way to deal with that is make sure your subject is in the center of the frame like I am, and you want to make sure the background is at a distance so it'll be out of focus. The soft areas will be mixed in with the out of focus, and it'll actually help with your composition. Let me show you a couple examples on how to use that to your advantage. Alright, so this is a pretty perfect example of the look you're going to get from the Mir in an interview type situation. I have it near wide open. I close it down just a little to get a little more sharpness on the face. Hopefully you can see some of the character in the background. It is a wide angle lens, so you're not going to get as much blur, of course. But this is probably a perfect scenario to see what it'll look like in this type of situation wide open. Alright, so one of the shortcomings of this lens is its minimum focusing distance. It's kind of long. You're going to want to do flowers or things close up and it just can't do it. I think it is 0.7 meters or like 27 inches. So that's not good. So there's a modification I did to this lens. I'll put a link below, where you remove the back half of the lens and you unscrew one of the stop screws. So that way you'll be able to turn the focusing ring a little past the minimum focusing distance. And I'm going to show you a picture now of a mango that I took after the modification, showing how close you can get to an object, and I think it's a wide open shot, so it'll also show just how much blur you can get in the background. So check it out. Alright, so one of the issues I'm having with this lens is how long the focus throw is. Don't get me wrong, it's good to have a long focus throw because it allows you to be precise on what you're focusing on. Very critical. Problem is, this focus throw is so long. For example, if you're at infinity and I'm trying to focus on something close, watch how I make this long turn. I'm still not there yet. I have to grab and turn some more until I finally reach the close focusing point. And the problem is, if you're shooting video and you're grabbing and re-grabbing and shaking the camera, and your footage can wind up unusable. Also, if you're doing street photography, you want to be able to focus in one motion quickly and take the shot. If you're double focusing, you're going to miss that decisive moment. So that's one issue I have with this lens, is the focus throw is actually too long. I want to show you something technical about this lens, the way the aperture works. If you notice, it's perfectly smooth. There's no clicks. What that means is it's good for video, in that if you're shooting in manual mode, you can adjust the exposure seamlessly without any clicks disturbing the video. That's a good thing. But there's something about the aperture that I don't particularly like. It's designed for film days. This ring right here is what's called a preset aperture. If you notice the numbers on it right now, you read the red dot on the front and it's reading f/16 right now. So what that means is the minimum aperture I can turn it to is f/16. That's as small as it'll go. If I adjust this ring to, say, 5.6, the minimum I can close it is 5.6. And finally, if I adjust it to 2.8, the aperture ring won't move at all, because the minimum aperture is stuck at its widest setting, which is 2.8. So this is called a preset aperture, and the reason it's made like this is in the film days, like for example a camera like this, the viewfinder is very dark in low light conditions, and you're going to want to open the aperture as wide as possible so you can focus and see what you're focusing on. And then you would turn it back down to the aperture that you preset. If you're using a mirrorless camera today, this is kind of irrelevant. You don't really need it. So in that case, what I do is I always just leave it at f/16. That way I can have the full movement of the aperture. The only downside to that is if it's wide open, you know it's f2.8. If it's all the way closed, you know that's f/16. But just like the Helios, everything in between, you're not exactly sure what the aperture is, because this red dot doesn't pertain to what aperture you're at. So it's kind of funky, but it was designed for the film days. All right, here's another trait that this lens has. A lot of the modern lenses, they try to reduce flare altogether, but this is an older lens and it has some flare, even though it has coatings. But That's one reason people love this lens, is because it's a kind of controlled flare, and some may say it's beautiful. And in some applications, especially if you're filming like something, a wedding pictures or some kind of stylized shoot, the flare can really enhance it. But there's other times where the flare won't. It may be too much or blocking your subject. So if you don't want the flare, I recommend using a lens hood. I started out using a tubular lens hood for this, and it worked fine on the Micro Four Thirds camera because it's slightly cropped. But when I use it on this particular full frame film camera, I'm going to show you a couple pictures where you'll see the corners. You'll actually see the lens hood in the corners of the shot. So I recommend, if you're getting a lens hood for this camera, to get the petal shaped ones with the cutouts in the corners, and it'll eliminate that issue. One thing I notice about this lens that I like is when I take a shot and I look at it, it usually doesn't require much editing. A lot of my older vintage lenses, when I look at them, I have to add a lot of contrast, sharpness, white balance, and different things to get it to look decent. But with this one, on the shots that you've seen, I usually only add a tad of sharpness and maybe a little local contrast, and left it alone. Even the colors are usually almost perfectly spot on. And it makes me realize maybe how this lens was able to get that award all those years ago. And it really shows that it's still relevant today if you're looking for vintage type of photography. Alright, if you're looking for one of these lenses, the best place, of course, to find it is going to be eBay. And most likely, like mine, it's going to come from different parts of Russia. It's rare, though, to find a vintage lens like this with all its accessories. My particular model looked like it was never used. It was made in the 70s. It didn't have a scratch on it. It came with the case, both end caps, and even a Russian instruction manual. But one thing I noticed, the serial number on that form didn't match the lens I had. But it's still cool to have original manuals for these lenses. Alright, so that is the lowdown on the Mir 1B 37mm Soviet lens. As you can see, it's very capable, and it's actually worthy of being called a classic lens because of the character it has, even though it's not perfect. There's no perfect lens yet, at least. I want to thank you for watching this episode of Ray's Real Reviews, and no matter what lens you choose to shoot on, as always, keep it real.